some of the stuff that Michel and Gonzalez talk about in the second part of the textbook, but I wanted to frame this as trying to ask the question of why does the Nacirema still fool people? In other words, why is it that when we read this article, we think to ourselves, yeah, there's a group of people that are doing these things somewhere else? Why don't we often tune into the fact that this is a satire? Why is it so difficult to get this article? Or why is it when an anthropology professor assigns it to you, you think, oh yeah, that's legit. That sounds like real anthropology. That sounds like anthropologists do and should be doing. So that's kind of going to frame our discussion of the history of anthropology and how it came to be an academic discipline. So this is a different way of answering a question that we began in the last class, which is the origins of anthropology and how it developed as an academic discipline. Anthropology developed out of a period of when European colonialism had conquered and subjugated many of the world's peoples and brought them under European influence, beginning with the discovery of what the Europeans called the New World in the Americas, the colonization of the Americas, and then the later colonization of Africa and parts of Asia by the European powers. And anthropology emerges actually rather late in this history. So after the Europeans had explored and colonized much of the world, anthropology begins to emerge as a study in Europe and in the United States and Canada, in North America, in the late 19th century. So we're talking about, the 1880s, 1890s, 1900s, about 100 years ago, maybe 150 years ago, if we're since we've gotten to 2020 already. But this is, as compared to some of the other academic disciplines that were emerging, anthropology emerged a little bit later than a lot of them. There were already established universities, and anthropology comes in a bit later. I've put up here the book, Europe and the People Without History. It's a book by Eric Wolf, who is an anthropologist. He wrote this book in 1985. I actually read this book my first year in college as an undergraduate, and it really influenced my thinking on the world. And what Eric Wolf was saying was that as the Europeans were colonizing the world, they were also creating this idea of the idea of the West or the Westerner, as well as everybody else. And when he says the people without history, he is actually being ironic, or he's saying that actually people had history and they were very important in the formation, but in some ways they were denied that history, or they were said to be locked in an ahistorical or a culture that was outside of the norm, which was taken to be the European norm. So when we talk about ethnocentrism, or the idea that your own society is doing the right thing and that everyone else should be doing things like you, there was a particular form of ethnocentrism that emerged in Europe and in the United States. And this is a simplification of the ideas about it. And it emerged, around in the 19th century, or, from 1800 on, you might say. And the idea is that we here in the US or in the European countries are the civilized people, and that those people in other places are savages or primitive or less advanced, and that everyone was on a kind of ladder of civilization or some sort of hierarchy in which people were moving from a primitive state towards a civilized state. And Lewis Henry Morgan, who was an anthropologist in the United States, also inserted this stage which he called barbarism into the middle of this ladder. And as Michel and Gonzalez say, this was the idea of a unilinear are one track of evolution. And the idea was that all societies could be ranked because they were all on this path from less civilized to more civilized. And Lewis Henry Morgan he didn't invent this idea. He just simply put it into kind of the textbook form, or made it into, incorporated into what was being then taught as science. Anthropology was assigned to study the peoples who was originally assigned to study the peoples who were outside of Europe and outside of North America. And so basically anthropologists would go into what people considered to be the strange places, and they were assigned to study all the other people. So if the sociologists at the time basically studied their own society, and the economists studied their own society, and the political scientists studied their own politics, anthropologists studied everybody else. And in crude terms, the crucial question of anthropology was, well, why are those people, why are the people who are not us like that? Why do they do the things they do? Why do they act the way they act? Why do they think the way they think? Are they going to change? My mentor, Michel-Rolph Trouillot, the Haitian anthropologist, wrote a very famous article called Anthropology and the Savage Slot. And what he meant by that is that there was a pre-existing idea in Europe and North America that the people outside of those spheres were savages. And basically, anthropology was the academic discipline that was assigned to study these people, or the discipline that was basically given the academic tools to study what were then considered to be the savages. The most prevalent explanations at the time were of racial determinism and also linked to environmental determinism. So the idea was that your physical features, your body, or your environment, your physical environment around you, determined your level of attainment, your level of civilization, your level of intelligence. And so people would go around measuring other people's heads and measuring their tongues to, if they had a certain language, they would wonder if there was a biological determinism to that language, or they would talk about the climate in different areas and, the seasons and those kinds of things, and how maybe it was that people who in different climates had different aptitudes. And so there was this weird mix of ideas around racial determinism and around environmental determinism for why people were different and behaved and thought differently than each other. Buckle and Gonzalez mentioned Franz Boaz, who is widely credited with being the founder of anthropology in the United States. He was a Jewish immigrant from Germany. He originally trained in physics, and his original field work was up in what was called Baffinland, up in the Arctic. And he began his life as an environmental determinist. He believed that because it was, going to be so cold and austere in this environment, the people would be all pretty much the same. And what he found out is that even in this, what we might consider to be a uniform environment, the people were very different, even as he moved a few miles or 20, 30 miles from place to place, he would find very different attitudes or different ways of thinking and behaving. And so one of his first things that he talked about is how the physical environment does not determine our behavior. Of course, it's very important where you live, and if you're in the tropics or in the Arctic, or you can grow wheat or you can grow corn, that makes a difference into what you will do. But of course, we're also very good as humans at trading things around and migrating and doing all those and interacting with each other. And so Boaz fought against the idea that our environment, our physical environment, determines our behavior. But perhaps most importantly, especially in the context of the United States, is Boaz fought against the idea that there was any evidence of racial superiority or racial determinism in terms of how people behaved and how they thought and what their levels of attainment were. Interestingly, one of his key studies was measuring the bodies and heads of people who were immigrating in from Ellis Island, especially from, at the time it was in the 1920s, they're immigrating from Eastern Europe and from Italy, and he was measuring the heads of immigrants in through Ellis Island, and then he would measure the physical form of their children. And what he determined was that even in one generation, and even if there was no intermarriage with other people, so they would only, even if they were marrying within their own group, that the body form of the immigrant children had changed in just one generation based on being in a new environment. And sometimes those of you who may have yourselves immigrant parents or grandparents and you look back at family photos, I know in my own family, my father was significantly taller than my grandparents. And so, I mean, my grandparents had come from Italy where there wasn't a lot of good food at the time. Well, the food was good, they just didn't have enough of it or good nutrition. And so, the physical form changed over time. And what Boaz concluded from this is the idea that these racial characteristics, what everybody assumed was a physical inheritance that was passed along, determining that there was no evidence that it was even a stable characteristic. We'll talk about this more as we talk about the idea of biological race, but Boaz was famous in fighting against the idea of racial superiority or determinism. What Boaz advocated instead was that when it came to explaining human differences, that they were due to culture. That the reason why people behaved and thought and did things differently was not something innate to our bodies. It wasn't something that was determined by our physical environment. It was a part of our learned behavior. And so Boaz took this word culture, which pre-existed anthropology, and he used it in a much wider sense to indicate the importance of learned behavior. And so he's associated with culture, with the idea of cultural relativism, and as Michel and Gonzalez put it, with historical particularism. So instead of thinking that everyone is on the same ladder or on the same line of history, the idea that each society develops in its own particular way, and you can't necessarily compare and say one is worse or one is better because they are adapting to different environments and have different ideas about the world. And so they are on their own particular path instead of being all on the same path from what we might call primitive to civilized. For Boaz, and again, we'll talk about this more in the middle of the course, culture had two important parts. And the first part is that we could see patterns in human behavior, so that, the way that we become human is in a particular way. For example, as we talked about in the last class with language, we all speak language all around the world. We all have language, but it is our particular language which also makes us different. So it's a similarity, but it is a particular which makes us become human in a very unique way. And of course, we then need to understand these patterns of behavior on their own terms. That's the idea of cultural relativism, that you want to make sense of how people behave, act, think in their own terms or on their own way. The second part of the idea of culture, and this is crucially important, is that we learn those patterns. Not necessarily in school, it's not, this is a small part of our learning, but in our lives, as we are growing up, as we are maturing in our society. So those patterns are learned. It means that the patterns of culture that we learn are not determined by our biology or what we might call our genetics. Again, not to say that biology or genetics aren't important, they are, but they do not, in the last instance, determine our behavior. And they're also not determined by our physical environment or our natural environment, which is of course important. You can't grow corn in the Arctic, but you can do all kinds of other things. And so we do not, our behavior is not necessarily determined by our physical environment. if we take this together, Boaz and other early anthropologists were some of the first to argue against this idea that all peoples could be ranked on a kind of ladder, or that there was a unilinear scale of evolution. And in fact, Boaz and others began to reject ideas that people could be placed into the categories of civilized and primitive, or developed and backward, that in fact everybody had to be evaluated according to their own terms, and the people who were adapted to a very different environment, one of the things that anthropologists discover when they go to do their field work is you become dependent upon the people there in a particular environment to sort of for your food and your clothing, and you could not survive with the skills that you had brought in from outside. And so people develop in a particular way in a particular place. This became known as US, the sort of the foundation of US anthropology, or Boasian anthropology, was kind of how it's been described as it developed as an academic discipline in the last 100 years in the United States. And so Franz Boas was, again, fighting against these ideas that are of racial determinism and ethnocentrism. He trained a whole cadre of anthropologists from very early on. Some of the most famous anthropologists were actually women. So Margaret Mead, probably the most famous US anthropologist, was a student of Franz Boas. Not everybody knows this, but Zora Neale Hurston, who is a very famous novelist and African-American author and figure, took courses and did fieldwork with Franz Boas. Michel-Gonzalez also mentioned that he trained people who were indigenous or Native Americans as collaborators, as people who were working with him to gather information about others. Boas is often seen as a heroic figure in anthropology, and he did importantly fight against the racial determinism and the racism of the time. We don't necessarily want to glorify him, though. He was also a believer in this idea of what Michel-Gonzalez calls salvage ethnography, the idea that you had to go and sort of take the artifacts and raid cemeteries for bones and remove those bones and artifacts for scientific study. So if you go now to the Museum of Natural History in New York City and you go into the Great Hall, there's a huge Kwakiutl canoe hanging from the ceiling. And that's something that Boas brought back from the west coast of the northwest coast of North America. And there were a number of kind of unsavory things that Boas and others participated in at the time. And I don't think we should overlook that. And so what in this sort of, there's this box in the Michel-Gonzalez textbooks about the current role of anthropology. After a while, after these initial fights against racism were kind of, they weren't over, but in some ways, as anthropology became settled as an academic discipline, it took a very different sort of approach as it became part of the popular culture and news media. And so the anthropologist Hugh Gusserson mentions that when you look at, say, the way anthropologists are talked about in the press or in the New York Times, that we become the guardians of the savage slot. And that is to say that people turn to anthropologists for the exotic trivia. Why do people smile? Why do they blow their nose? What do these strange people do over there? And so as Gusserson and Michel-Gonzalez put it, anthropology is the people that others turn to as doing the fluffy bits of human nature. People don't think about anthropologists when they're thinking about the economy or politics, even though many anthropologists study power and political economy. The people who show up in the press or on TV are the ones that are doing these funny little things. In other words, and this is now wrapping us back to the Nacirema, the reason that the Nacirema still fool us today is that these sort of cute little stories or even brutal stories of people off in the distance who do their strange rituals and we can't figure out why they do them is something that anthropology continues, unfortunately, to reproduce. We're going to be trying to get away from that in this class, but it's something that when we think outside the classroom and its approach in the popular media, that's what happens a lot of times. So I want to talk about now, and again, wrapping back to the Nacirema, that, I think there's an enduring relevance to the Nacirema. I think it's useful for us to read, but we should also recognize that there are some problems with it, or that it doesn't solve the issues that we need to address if we want to sort of move forward in the world. And one of the key issues that has always bothered me about the Nacirema is that it simply flips the script, right? So we look weird to them, they look weird to us, but it keeps the idea that the us and them are separate. So it doesn't talk about how, in fact, like we were talking about with Eric Wolf and Europe and the People Without History, these groups have been interconnected and trading and being have been co-producing each other. We have been interconnected with other societies since the beginning of being humans. And so to simply sort of say, oh, they're funny to us, we're funny to them, as if we are in separate worlds, doesn't get at that interaction and interconnection. In the same vein, a lot of the stereotypes that Horst Miner is drawing on in the Nacirema, the medicine man and the potions and all these things are things that we would associate with Native American tribes. And he's sort of being cute by putting them onto American society, but it's probably worth remembering how uncool American society is toward the indigenous peoples that he's now in some ways appropriating. This is a society that has been very hostile to Native Americans and to indigenous peoples, and to somehow use that as a kind of cute, oh wow, look at us if they called us medicine men, is worth thinking about in terms of, is that something we really want to do? The other thing that is bothersome about the Nacirema is that it portrays another society, in this case our own, as homogeneous, that is to say, all the same, and as frozen in time, as sort of not changing over time. And, I think Horst Miner's point may be that we shouldn't portray other peoples that way, because if we recognize how much that is incorrect about ourselves, then we should be suspicious of any portrayal of another people as sort of locked or frozen in time. And this is why I said from the beginning that we have to realize that culture is dynamic, fluid, and ever-changing. So we don't want to just say, oh, that's their culture, and lock people into another form of determinism, a cultural determinism, which means that they can't think for themselves or reflect upon their own culture or their own society. So, maybe we can think about the Nacirema in terms of, it's also a warning to us when we look at other societies, that we shouldn't think that everyone is all the same, or that they are locked into a certain form of behavior. Finally, I would just emphasize that it is very rare that you just have this sort of funny, cute ethnocentrism where, oh, well, they wear orange hats, but we wear green hats, and isn't that funny? Usually, almost always, ethnocentrism is linked to power, or some sort of power relationship between a dominant group and a subordinate group, or some form of inequality, in which our ideas about other people are also ideas about the way people should behave. So there are surely instances in which, oh, you eat hot dogs, that is so weird, ha, 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 and it doesn't really matter. But a lot of times ethnocentrism is linked to power, and we always have to be careful when there is a power relationship between or within another society. So at the end of this chapter, Michel and Gonzalez talk about, okay, well, given that anthropology has this history of being part of colonialism, of being part of these stereotypes, of being involved in this wider world in which it's sometimes difficult to make headway because we are always talking about what we might consider the fluffy bits of being human, how do we approach the world? So what Michel and Gonzalez are going to be telling us, and what we're going to be emphasizing in this class, is that understanding and appreciating human diversity, getting that perspective of cultural relativism, is going to be crucial if we want to understand issues like climate change or sustainability, food security and how we're going to produce food, or even issues like how people do business in different societies, or how our politics might be different from society to society. So from the beginning, we are going to need to understand and be able to communicate across diverse perspectives. Michel and Gonzalez believe, and I do too, that anthropology can help to contribute to understanding diversity, and it can help to contribute to, and must contribute to, helping people communicate and understand each other. But we can't do it if we're only going to be confined to the role of, oh, you tell us how people wiggle their noses. We have to, in some ways, find a way to enter the kind of mainstream of the, the issues of the time, and talk about the ways in which, where there are very serious economic and political and social issues that anthropologists, by having a cross-cultural and cross-historical perspective, might be able to comment upon. Crucially, though, Michel and Gonzalez emphasized that anthropologists have too often looked kind of like me. So there's been a predominance of white anthropologists, of male anthropologists, and unfortunately, we still do not have a greater diversity of, in terms of ethnicity and race representation among anthropologists, and it's something that I hope that some of you will be able to go on and address. We need to have, if we're going to talk about humanity, we need to have a discipline that looks more like humanity. So we're generally a little bit better when it comes to gender in anthropology. As I mentioned, some of the earliest anthropologists, most prominent anthropologists like Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict were women, but especially in recent years, we have not been as diverse anthropologically as we could and should be. And Michel and Gonzalez bring up a word on page 20 called decolonization, that we want to see anthropology as allied to this effort. So, if anthropology emerges in a time of colonization, of a time in which European and North American ideas were taken to be, the best ideas or the only ideas, and everyone else was kind of made to conform to that and made to and subordinated to those ideas. In recent years, we have discovered that in fact there are other ways of thinking, and that some of these groups that were originally studied by anthropologists have not disappeared, and they are actually very interested in recovery and decolonizing, or getting rid of these, or thinking outside of the standard European North American trajectory for religious beliefs or economic practices or political forms. And so anthropology needs to be an ally in this decolonization effort. Or put differently, we need to be supportive of the descendants of the people, the populations that made anthropology possible as an academic discipline. In today's world, anthropologists study all over the place, and so hopefully there will be anthropologists studying in North America. My wife is an anthropologist. She studies medical anthropology. She studied pregnancy in North America, actually in Michigan. And so, you know, people study in their own country. However, as an academic discipline, we also need to understand our roots and the sort of the people and the studies which made anthropology possible.